Many of us know Dr. Jordan B. Peterson as the public intellectual and self-help guru who advises his followers to embrace personal responsibility and abstain from insidious and pathological ideology, that is, democracy. He's a best-selling author, a highly paid public speaker. To his fans, he represents a father figure, the professor they never had, and a hero who through grit or the gift of brilliance has achieved the sort of fame usually reserved for athletes, actors, and pop stars. But imagine for a moment if JP were not a celebrity and just an ordinary person. Or, in Petersonese, picture him not as the lobster king perched on the apex of his dominance hierarchy, but as a modest, everyday arthropod on one of his paradigm's lower strata. Specifically, I'd like you to imagine that Peterson is your co-worker. So for that, we'll need a scenario. You're a middle-aged man, sorry ladies, who works in an office in an urban setting, and JP is a new employee. You get to know each other a little, exchange a bit of office banter, and one day the two of you go out to grab lunch. The server brings you menus, you order the lunch special, and Peterson orders a steak a la carte. You talk about work, and JP launches into a spiel in which he counsels you on how to get a promotion. To climb the corporate ladder, he insists, you need to see yourself as a monster. He adds that achieving success entails becoming the hero of your own story, and that the hero has to become a monster, but a controlled monster. When you ask what he means, he says you should strive to become an evil monster, and confides that he sees himself as an evil monster. As the server returns with your beverage, Peterson says, recognizing yourself as the locus of evil, let's say, actually in some sense gives you far more respect for yourself, strangely enough, in the same respect you might have for a wild animal, or even a monster. When you ask why he's talking about wild animals and keeps suggesting you become a monster, he says you've likely been passed over for promotion because you're too good or passive and you need to harness your dark side and behave in a way that's more aggressive. Here's something to think about, he tells you. Carl Jung believed that the pathway to completion was through the, embodiment of the monster. That's the discovery of the shadow. So Jung didn't believe that you could be a good person until you realized your capacity for evil. Some people are only good. They're like a domesticated house cat. They don't even have the capacity to be bad. So there's no morality in that. The morality comes when you're a monster. If you start to understand who you are, then you understand the Nazis. You blink. Morality comes when I'm a monster? And what? The Nazis. Fixing you with his dead-eyed glare, Peterson says, you have to understand that you could not only do what the Nazi camp guards did in Auschwitz, but that you could actually enjoy it. Enjoy it, you ask? Sure, he says. It's like, if you were there, that would have been you. You think, well, I'd be Oskar Schindler. I'd be rescuing the Jews. It's like, I'm afraid not. You'd at least not be saying anything, and you might also be actively participating. He fights back a smile. You might also enjoy it. I don't think I'd enjoy it, you tell him. Hey, a new NHL season's underway. Are you into hockey at all? I could enjoy it, Peterson responds. I've been telling people that for years. When I was 13, I wrote a paper about Auschwitz because I was trying to understand how human beings could do that, knowing full well that I was one of them. It dawns on you that you should have brown bagged it today. You knew at age 13 that you would have liked to work as a guard at Auschwitz? When I was 13, I was really into baseball. How about you? Do you like baseball? The Blue Jays went pretty far this year. I prefer comedy, Peterson says. Have you heard of Count Dankula, the alt-right comedian from Scotland? Can't say that I have. Oh, you're missing out. Count Dankula didn't like his girlfriend's pug, and so he thought he'd play a mean trick, or mean/funny trick, and teach it to do a Hail Hitler salute, which I actually thought was quite funny. And he taught it to... it's so horrible. He taught it to do his little salute, Peterson raises his hand, to... gas the Jews, which is not funny, except it's horribly funny. He goes on. So, at Auschwitz there was a sign that said, work will make you free. It was a little joke. Not really a very funny joke. It's the kind of joke you have to be, satanic is the appropriate term to conceptualize and to dare to state. Even though you don't need to use it, you glance around for the bathroom. And when the Jews got to Auschwitz, the guards used to have this game they would play, and this is part of the work will set you free thing. They would take a prisoner who was already, in pretty rough shape, and then have them carry a sack of wet salt, 100 pounds, from one side of the camp to the other. Now, that's poetic in its malevolence. The server brings you a salad. Peterson gazes at it with contempt. You want some, you ask? Peterson locks onto you with another one of his stares. I eat beef and salt and water. That's it. And I never cheat. Ever. Not even a little bit. Okay, you respond. I try to avoid salt. Peterson says, A typical Auschwitz example was the requirement for prisoners to carry 100-pound sacks of wet salt from one side of the compound to another and then back again. Now that's evil as far as I'm concerned. And you have to think about it from an aesthetic perspective, in a sense, because it's a celebration of horror. A celebration of horror? You desperately hope that someone occupies the next table so you can strike up a conversation with them. Yeah, I have no trouble envisioning myself taking someone who just got off a transport train at a concentration camp and have them carry a 100-pound sack of wet salt from one side of the compound to the other. People don't like to picture themselves doing things like that because it's too frightening, but I know perfectly well that I could do that sort of thing, and maybe I could even enjoy it. Are you a Nazi? You ask. Ha! That's exactly what someone would say if they were ideologically possessed. God, where did you learn to think like that? University? Those places, man, they've become snake pits. It's like, to the radical postmodernist Bolshevik ideologues, everyone they don't like is Hitler. They're reprehensible, pathological, and reprehensible, and that's that. So you're not a Nazi then? Of course not. But Hitler was an organizational genius. He appealed to the darkest fantasies of the crowd, and he was really good at it. And he started to reindustrialize the German economy, and he was actually pretty damned good at that. And Hitler was a canny person with a brilliant sense of drama. He was a master of dark fire, that guy. I mean, you don't want to burn everything that the person that you fear owns. You want to burn everything that the person who disgusts you owns. And so you'll see people now who are pushing the nationalist agenda hard, and Hitler did this beautifully. Everything that was outside the Aryan domain of purity wasn't to be feared. It was disgusting, it was contemptuous, and it should be destroyed and purified by fire. And that was his message. The Nazis were unbelievably great at using fire of purification as a symbolic message. Are you talking about burning the corpses of Jews in ovens? Peterson says, no, of course not. That's absurd. Honestly, politics today, you say one little thing that's slightly conservative, man, and it's like, poof, the Nuremberg trials part 2 for you. Jesus, it's just appalling. I'm saying that Hitler was unbelievably good at spectacle and order. I mean, one thing Hitler was good at was order. Hell, the Germans are good at order. Just think of the organization and order that went into the Holocaust. The Germans are an organized people. So you're from Alberta? Yep, Fairview. And what's Fairview like? It's flat, but it's also the place I began my quest after I had my dreams about nuclear holocaust. My dreams were trying to tell me something. They were fundamentally religious in nature, let's say. When I was in my 20s, I began to dream absolutely unbearable dreams. My dream life, prior to a psychological split I had where I began hearing a voice that kept telling me, "You don't believe that isn't true," had been relatively uneventful. Nonetheless, my dreams became so horrible, I was often afraid to go to sleep. I dreamt dreams vivid as reality. They centered around a single theme: nuclear war and total devastation. Around the worst evils that I, or something in me, could imagine. You think, something in him? My parents lived in a standard ranch-style house in northern Alberta. I was sitting in the darkened basement of this house, in the family room, watching TV, with my cousin Diane, who was in truth, in waking life, the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. A newscaster suddenly interrupted the program. The television picture and the sound distorted, and static filled the screen. My cousin stood up and went behind the TV to check the electrical cord. She touched it and started convulsing and frothing at the mouth, frozen upright by the intense current. A brilliant flash of light from a small window flooded the basement. I rushed upstairs. There was nothing left of the ground floor of the house. It had been completely and cleanly sheared away. Red and orange flames filled the sky from horizon to horizon. Nothing was left as far as I could see, except skeletal black ruins sticking up here and there. No houses, no trees, no signs of other human beings or of any life whatsoever. The entire town of Fairview, Alberta, and everything that surrounded it on the flat prairie had been completely obliterated. It started to rain mud heavily, and a few distraught and shell-shocked people started to gather together. They were carrying unlabeled and dented cans of food, which contained nothing but mush and vegetables. They stood in the mud looking exhausted and disheveled. Some dogs emerged, out from under the basement stairs, where they had inexplicably taken residence. They were standing upright, on their hind legs. They were thin, like greyhounds, and had pointed noses. They looked like creatures of ritual, like Anubis from the Egyptian tombs. They were carrying plates in front of them, which contained pieces of seared meat. They wanted to trade the meat for the cans. I took a plate. In the center of it was a circular slab of flesh, 4 inches in diameter and 1 inch thick, foully cooked, oily, with a marrow bone in the center of it. Where did it come from? I had a terrible thought. The waiter appears and plunks Peterson's steak on the table. There you are. Enjoy. Oh, thanks, eh? Anyway, I rushed downstairs to my cousin. The dogs had butchered her and were offering the meat to the survivors. I dreamed apocalyptic dreams of this intensity 2 or 3 times a week for a year or more while I attended university classes and worked, as if nothing out of the ordinary was going on in my mind. You say you heard a voice? Yeah, I heard a voice. You know, I learned when I was a kid, about 25 or so, almost everything I said was one form of lie or another, and the lies were manifold. And I had this experience that has lasted a long time. Well, I would say it's never really gone away. And I think that this was the awakening of my conscience, essentially. This voice, for lack of a better word, made itself manifest inside me. And it said, every time I said something that wasn't true, that's usually what it said. That's not true. You don't believe that. Or there was this sensation that was associated with it. You can have this internal voice, this daemon. Anyways, back to the truth, I learned that so much of what I was doing was false, and there was a reason that this came to me so clearly. I was trying to understand why people did terrible things, and I was really concentrating on the terrible, terrible things that people do. I was interested in Auschwitz, for example, and not as a political phenomenon, but as a psychological phenomenon. I was curious about how you could be an Auschwitz guard. Well, I wasn't really curious about how you could be one, because, well, you could be one, of course. I was more curious about how I could be one, being such a good person, as I thought I was. And I also knew that many people did many terrible things during the 20th century, and the idea that I was somehow better than them, or that I should assume that I wouldn't have made the same choices, or worse, had I been in the same situation, was a very, very, very dangerous supposition. And I was reading Carl Jung at the time, and he believed that the human soul was a tree whose roots grew all the way to hell. And he believed also that a full investigation of the shadow, which was the dark side of the human psyche, was that it was bottomless, essentially. It was like an experience of hell. And that also struck me as true. It struck you as true? Or the voice told you it was true? Carving up his steak, Peterson says, well, when the voice appeared and began neutrally judging me, just sort of watching me, I thought, maybe I fragmented, and that's really not a good thing at all. I mean, he points his fingers to the right side of his head. It wasn't like I was hearing voices or anything like that. It wasn't like that. It was, well, people have multiple parts. This is the end of the sketch. Obviously, I've taken Peterson's words out of context, or at least somewhat. That said, at least 95% of what I've had Peterson say during this invented exchange is him speaking verbatim. He makes such statements routinely, and people pay money to hear them. But I ask you, if you had an experience like this, or if every second or third time you spoke to, say, an office mate, neighbor, or acquaintance, and they made such statements, what would you think? Would you think, wow, you're brilliant, you should write a self-help book and tell people how to live their lives? In that self-help book, you should compare people to crustaceans, cite the Bible, and include quotes from mass murderers and Adolf Hitler. It's standard practice in the self-help genre. Be sure to feature a section on parenting, wherein you emphasize the importance of smacking your kids. And don't forget to include pictures of the serial rapist and serial murderer, Karl Panzram, who confessed to raping and killing children, as well as an image of a dead baby. Really, 12 Rules for Life has a picture of a dead baby. What self-help book doesn't? Would you say to such a person, you know, people really go in for your kind of wisdom, and what the world needs now is more people like you to guide them? Would you think such a person was a genius? Would you think he, how should I put it, had a few issues? As I explain in my book, The Devil in His Due, How Jordan Peterson Plagiarizes Adolf Hitler, what the media has called the Jordan Peterson phenomenon is in fact a death cult. Perhaps journalists might have figured this out if they weren't so busy ignoring Peterson, or had pieced together that 12 Rules for Life is intended not to help, but to harm, or if they weren't so preoccupied with trivialities like Peterson's all-meat diet. Steak, anyone? As Peterson says, life is suffering. Thank you for listening, and please hit like and subscribe.